about it in a two-dimensional way. And we heard a lot about that from Lord Putnam. Where is the three-dimensional concepts of learning? And I think we also think about learning as single stimulation. I was sat at home the other day, throwing up. I'd like to say I was ill. I think I just drunk too much the night before. And it was the day of the launch of Ofsted's annual report. And I was sat there in bed with my bucket, puking, embarrassingly, 2 laptops on with between them 5 news stations broadcasting at me, and I was having a quick game of online poker, as you do. That's multiple stimulation, and that's how kids are being brought up now. Well, they're clearly not being brought up to be alcoholics and vomit in buckets, but generally, that's how they are being brought up, and yet we do everything in a one stimulational dimension. Which I don't think helps. But I do want to talk about some of the examples where I think we are using technology, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worst, and then come on to what I think the customers need. In schools, we saw whiteboards being used from Brian's presentation. And I'll just give you one example of what I think is a really great use of an interactive tool. I took my children to Lebanon after the bombing there in the south of Lebanon to see the impact. I'm really odd. I just put that up front. I took my kids to a minefield to see the damage that cluster bombs do with a bomb disposal expert to have a look at it. And it is really, God, does that tell you something about why you don't want a war? Just seeing these walls splattered with these shells of these cluster bombs and meeting the limbless children that are left as a result of the mass shelling of cluster bombs in that part of Lebanon. And my kids walked through a minefield, which was a little exciting. Don't move. Okay, I really am not going to move. And my daughter collected some shrapnel. She was 8 at the time. Some leftover bits and pieces. We went through a factory that had been bombed, and she collected some of the melted fragments of this particular war. And while she was going, she was doing a little video diary on her mobile phone, so she was taking pictures and talking about what she was seeing. And she went back into school after this. We were, don't tell anyone, I'm the chairman of Ofsted. We were actually bunking off. It was during school time we went. Oops. So we missed our school attendance figures there. But she went back into school, and the teacher did a bit of show and tell. Sit down on the carpet and tell us what you did. He put up the whiteboard was there for, the interactive whiteboard was there for registration, and she stood up with her bits of shells and started talking and said, well, if you put the Bluetooth on, I'll Bluetooth you my little video presentation. So the kids got into that, and then one of the children wanted to see some news clippings, so they downloaded some past news clippings of when it had been bombed. And then they looked at the history of the conflict between Lebanon and Israel. These were 7-year-olds leading their own learning. This was not being done by the teacher. This is great use of technology, but it isn't that widespread, I fear. Online courses are fabulous, and there are really good examples of online courses and online revision. I mean, anyone who isn't using GCSE Pod, if you're wanting to do them, it's a great tip. It just tells you how to pass really quickly and easily. And there are great things like that. I think one of the greatest uses of technology is international collaboration. I was fostered by a Ghanaian family and grew up in England, partly fostered and partly living at home when that was appropriate. So I've got very strong links with Ghana. And I went out to a special school, to visit a special school in Ghana when I was last there. I was actually there for the African Nations Cup. Didn't I sound altruistic then? I'd gone for my passion, my football. But while I was there, I thought I'd go and visit a few schools, as you do. And I went and visited a special school, and they were putting on a play, a production, and I videoed it on my mobile phone, obviously, a little video clip, and took it back to a special school I have good, strong links with. My nephew's there. One of my nephews is there in Portsmouth. And they've developed a fantastic creative online collaboration where they're now doing joint co-productions using video conferencing and the World Wide Web to put on joint plays between a Ghanaian very poor school and a special school in England. These are fabulous examples of where technology and collaboration can take us. And we need to look at how we can get over that fear to make them far more widespread. We see real examples, I think, where pupils are using technology in the school system, whether that's to do their GCSE pod revision very quickly, or whether it's, I'll give you an example of my 14-year-old son. He was sat in lessons, in a lesson, and the teacher was up there, and she'd written the learning objectives on the board, on the blackboard with a piece of chalk, and the girl sat next to him and said, she's missed one learning objective. So my son, being the idiot, and just watch this story and how it pans out and watch the difference between boys and girls. The girl next to him says, she's missed a learning objective. So my son sticks his hand up and goes, Miss, you've missed a learning objective, and it's this, blah, blah, blah. She's a bit cross, but she writes it on the board. And about 20 minutes later, she said, oh, I think she skipped a bit here. I think we're supposed to be looking at cloud formation now. Idiot. Miss, aren't we supposed to be looking at cloud formation? That's my son. So she gets very cross and starts talking about cloud formation. A little while later, the girl says to him, I'll tell you what the homework's going to be. You may as well write it down now. Idiot boy sticks his hand up and says, Miss, the homework you're going to give us is this, isn't it? Can we all bugger off now? Obviously, he's sent out the class. He's in major league trouble. But when you have that much learning content available on the web that kids can download into their hand, if all you're going to do is reproduce what's there as a teacher, you're going to be seriously caught out. Obviously not by the boys. He was sent to the... Mr. Walker is his name, by the way, in my son's school. He's in charge of all the naughty boys. And I see a lot of Mr. Walker. Far too much of Mr. Walker. You know, if you look at some of the things that pupils are doing, a Nintendo, dreadful game, isn't it? Frightful little dog, drives me mad. How many times have I tried to kill that thing? But they've started to use it, particularly in Scotland. They've built in a programme now where kids are actually learning some core lessons whilst they're looking after these vile little puppies and helping them grow, not just about animal husbandry, but about financial transactions. They go in and they buy things, they're doing money, they're doing maths, they're doing cooperation, they're doing business studies. And those are really good examples. And that was actually designed by a pupil and sent off to Nintendo, who bought it and are piloting it in Scottish schools in a really exciting way. Another example of how technology is being used, and I think will increasingly be used, for holding people to account for the standards. There's a bit of technology buzzing away over there. For the standards that they see in their schools. Last winter, it was very snowy in my part of the world, in Portsmouth in England, which is incredibly unusual. It never snows there. And the snow comes tumbling down, and my son gets up, obviously being my son, and says, I don't want to go to school today, Mum, I want to play in the snow. Bugger off and get to school. You're going to school. Anyway, halfway through the day, I get a phone call. Actually, this is deeply embarrassing, but I get a phone call sitting outside the Secretary of State for Education's office, as you do, because I'm chairman of Ofsted, waiting to go in and talk to him. And I get this phone call from my son saying, Mum, the teacher's, listen to this, the teacher sat with his feet up reading a newspaper and there's a riot going on in the class. And I can just hear all this noise in the background. I said, there isn't a riot. You're out in the playground and it's playtime. Shut up, and hung up. 2 minutes later, I get a little MMS and I get a little video clip and there's a riot going on in his classroom. Oh, right, okay. So I phoned Mr. Walker. I've got my revenge now. So I phoned Mr. Walker and I said, Mr. Walker, there's a riot going on in 2B. Would you go down and sort it out? Because my son's trying to use it as an excuse to bunk out of school, and I told him he's got to stay. And about half an hour later, I get another little MMS. And before I get a chance to open it, Mr. Walker phones me up and says, there was no riot going on in that classroom. I said, what? He said, I've been in there. I've told your son off. He's now in detention for the rest of the week. There was no riot. He was just using it as an excuse to get out of lessons. And I'm thinking, that's a bit odd. So I open the MMS as I put down the phone, and there's another video, and it's the class, and it's the teacher, and it's Afra stood at the door, and she says, Sir, Mr. Walker's coming. Sir says, and I've got it on video, Oi, you lot, look busy, start doing your work, or you're in detention for a week. Another lesson about how stupid my son is, who was in detention for the week. It certainly wasn't the teacher. But we will use technology to hold people to account for their learning. No more so than when we look at what is already available when you sit your exams. If you've taken in England an Edexcel exam, although they haven't made this available, it is available if the teaching unions and the schools wanted it. When you've sat your exam, you can download it for £1 is all it will cost you, your GCSE, and you'll be able to see your mark for that. You'll see your paper scanned in. You'll see your mark for that paper. You'll see your mark for every single question. You'll see the average mark for your class, and you'll see the average mark for the nation. So you will know full well that you didn't learn Anne Boleyn, because your class knew nothing about Anne Boleyn and the rest of the country did. So we will be able to hold people to account and say, why aren't you learning? Of course, you can do that now with online tests for Edexcel throughout the year that benchmarks you against every single other pupil that has done that, so you can instantly know what you don't know. And I think learning is as much about learning what you don't know as it is about learning what you need to know. So technology, I think, will really transform assessment, and it will also transform teaching and learning. But it will put the customer in the driving seat. And I've said a bit about who do I mean by customers. Well, I mean pupils and learners, I mean parents, I mean employers, I mean the government. What I do not mean is schools. What I do not mean is teachers. What I do not mean is education systems. And what I do not mean is buildings. And yet I believe we have structured our learning around those things, not around the customer. And